So in the last chapter on social influence, we want to maybe take a look at the mirror in our mirrors and say that are we all evil? What can we learn from Milgram's experiments and findings, from these shocking findings that so many people, so many of us, that probably you and I are willing to shock another person just because we are ordered to do so? How can we explain this powerful impact that obedience has on our behavior? Very early on, I think people were motivated to do this research, as much of this research on social influence in general, but trying to better understand why so many people in Germany kind of followed the orders of the Nazis, why the Nazi regime was able to inflict the terror on its world with such efficiency, why so many followed that. And so there's one answer you can say, that maybe there's something in Germans that kind of strongly resonated with the ideas of the Nazi regime. So maybe in other countries like Italy or Japan, who are allies of the Nazi regime as well. So maybe there are certain people who are more prone to kind of show obedience and to be punitive. So this is like, I think a lot of the research early on started coming from this position. And then there was a stronger shift towards situational powers. I think if you remember our very, very first session about social psychology is also kind of situational psychology. Social psychologists very strongly believe in the power of the situation, believe that shifting the conditions and the layout of a situation dramatically impacts the behavior we have. And as you will see when we go on, a lot of the factors that kind of outline the situation of the Milgram experiment have real profound impact on the behavior of these people. So I think the first, very often, I think we have to talk about it quickly, was motivated by by one Jewish German researcher, Adorno, and he had this idea that there's basically an authoritarian personality. He developed a fascism scale, and it was trying to kind of pin down people who believe that an authoritarian ruler is great. We need strong leaders. We need people who, they don't have to obey the laws. They can do whatever they want to do. They're ethnocentric, which is a fancy word for basically being racist. They're intolerant to dissent. They're punitive. They enjoy punishing others, but they're also fine with being punished. Just kind of like following and leading somewhat is in their genes. And there is some evidence that A, these people exist, and B, that these people are slightly more willing to punish. But, and here's the big but, and the rest of this chapter will be about this but, is personality factors don't seem to matter that much. You saw it with gender factors, with cultural factors. It doesn't seem to very much impact strongly the results of the Milgram experiment. So very early on, it became clear that what's driving this behavior is the situation and the specific layout of the situation, the setup, and the social situation, and not so much the personality. So what is it about the situation that drives the behavior? One of the key factors is perceived authority. So let us kind of look at the variations. I think Milgram altogether tested, about 1,000 participants. I think he did something like 15 odd variations of his experiment. And here you can see on the y-axis, on the x-axis, the percentage of participants who this is here, the x-axis, who fully showed full obedience, right? We have kind of like a control condition where there are no prompts. And remember, this were about 3% of the people showed full obedience. That is, they went to the highest shock. And now we have here the results of females and males. They basically have exactly, I think it's 64 and 65. They have, or maybe they might even have the exact same number of full obedience in their group. So this is basically the setup, okay? So now he started to show variations, or he started to experiment with variations. One of them was kind of centered around authority. So the idea here was that in our initial experiments, you would come into Yale, a prestigious scientific institution. There would be this man standing in a lab coat, kind of scientific lab coat, really representing all of science. And that was kind of like, what if we take this away? There are two variations of that. One, they did it in a kind of ordinary business building. It was just like, imagine you drive somewhere and there's like this one of these kind of anonymous office buildings, and you would just go into a floor and there would be a researcher. But now the researcher and the whole institution setting is not bestowed so much with the kind of authority of Yale and science. So now you see quite a big drop. Now about only slightly less than 50% are willing to go to full obedience. The most strong, but much more, is like if it's just another person. If instead of the participant being dressed as a scientist and behaving as a scientist, representing the scientific community, if it's just an ordinary person, you can see this is 19% about here show full obedience. That is, if you perceive kind of the perceived authority of the person is undermined, if the person does not represent a scientific community, this expert power, then people stop following orders. At least 80%, right? Here's like 80% do not show full obedience. So there's a dramatic drop. Now, it's basically, if this is just done by an ordinary person, the results almost flip, right? Another one which Milgram kind of was interested in seeing is proximity to the victim. He saw this quite dramatic shift when it's basically run by an ordinary person, a Milgram expert, not a scientist anymore. The other thing was like, okay, what if we increase the proximity between the teacher, in quotations mark, and the recipients of the shocks, the learner, right? What if we either make it remote, or if we kind of increase the contact? So they have three different conditions that center around that. So there's a teacher touching the learner. So I show you a picture in a second of that. The learner and the teacher are in the same room, and the experimenter is removed. Okay, so here you kind of remove the power of the authoritarian figure. Maybe this might be even better situated in the section beforehand, but you see there's another dramatic drop. So if the experimenter, if the person who kind of prompts you to continue is not in the same room. Actually, in this experiment, he would phone in. He would be on the telephone telling you to please continue. That is a drop of 20%. Okay. So again, most people, 8 out of 10 or 80 out of 100, would not show obedience or full obedience in these experiments. There's I think, somewhat almost shocking lack of reduction when the teacher touches the learner, or if they're in the same room. I'll show you a picture in a second of this variation because it's so dramatic, but you can see it seemed to be kind of like it has an impact. I mean, clearly it has an impact. Here we have like 33%, right, in this condition. And here's a picture of this condition, right? Prevents, I think I come back to that. But you can see they're basically holding it. He's screaming here, and you're holding it, and they're still continue to go on. So I think that here we find 33% is rather shocking, right? It's not like, oh my God, there's like, okay, out of 100 people, 30 to 33 would still be willing to shock a person, even if they have to touch that person, right? So there's a reduction. Here is kind of like this idea that it's harder to dehumanize a person if you have to touch a person. If you see a person in his or her full blooming humanity, then it's hard to kind of ignore that you're actually hurting somebody. And this is kind of the idea behind that, right? There's some kind of bureaucrat who administers shocks without ever getting into touch with their victims, and that helps to fuel it. And it definitely helps. And yet, I think the reduction to 33% is something where I think, as a human being, I would hope it would have been somewhat stronger. A final condition is if you include rebels. What happens if you include other participants who are participating or have to do the same thing, and they stop? They are disobedient. And here you can see you have a dramatic drop, right? It's like now about only 10% of the participants show full obedience when two Confederates are disobedient. Okay, when two of the basically people who are in part of the experiment refuse to continue, then only 10 in 100 people are still willing to obey. So I think There are other factors. Let me quickly outline 4 more factors that were not systematically tested, but most of us social psychologists feel like really contributed to that. First of all, think of Ash. Think of Ash and Sharif. We have a lack of social norms here. You're coming in a situation where you're really uncertain. You really don't know how you should behave. And as you remember now, the social influence in uncertain situations, in situations without clear rules and regulations, that's when social impact is the strongest. Especially then, what should happen is that we look to an authority figure. We look to somebody who can help us. And there, it's another one. There's a person with expert status who tells us we should continue. So we are unsure what we should do. We kind of look around and boom, there's this person that is helping us. The other one is that is guiding us. So this is like a kind of like a really, really fruitful situation constructed in order to show a maximum impact of obedience. The other one is like extreme time pressure, right? You have to go on, continue. You have to do it now. He has to get the shock after he made a mistake. You can't delay that, right? There's this other one, which is like, which I kind of wanted to say here as well, is that there's also that the scientist says that they're responsible for the results. You should continue. I'm responsible for these things. And that was kind of used because if you think about situations where somebody comes to you and gives you orders, for instance, in the army or in the police, or maybe as a bureaucrat trying to do something terrible, there's like, it's my decision. I'm the leader. Follow those orders. It's my responsibility. And so the scientists in these situations said the same thing. There's time pressure. You know from time pressure that when this is more likely to kind of induce a shallow processing, the peripheral route, how we often called it, and that leads us to use cues in order to guide our behavior rather than real deep processing. So we are in an uncertain situation. We have like an authority figure, an expert figure that says, please continue. We are under time pressure. The other thing is, which is also quite interesting, is that it uses this kind of foot in the door technique, right? It's like, you just gave this somewhat small shock. Now we want to increase a little bit, okay? So you committed to one act. Now we want you to commit it to a stronger act. So there's something like really clever about this. I think if we would go in and say like, here, like they made a mistake. Do you want to shock them full throttle to life-endangering levels? Then participants would probably be much more resistant, but they kind of get sucked into it by the foot in the door technique. So there are many factors that we now think like increase the impact of the obedience and the orders in these situations. Yet I think if you can see, right, there's like, it's a very specific situation, and if you shift maybe 1 or 2 factors, suddenly out of 100 people, only 10 obey, right? But if you ask people, high school students, for instance, if you ask students who did their A-levels, what they think is the biggest lesson learned from the Milgram experiment, maybe the most famous experiment in social psychology for sure, but probably in psychology in general, then they said like, humans follow blindly orders, okay? And scientists, actually non-psychological scientists, often say something very similar. It seems like that this message that basically these experiments show that we blindly follow orders is kind of what people take out. Yet there are many factors to kind of question that. So why is this message so resonating with not only A-level high school students, but also other scientists? So at that time, when they started to do the Milgram experiment, when Milgram started his experiments, there were, which is quite an influential way of thinking about this what's called the agentic state. Why do people do so many terrible things? And this is largely kind of due to the work by Hannah Arendt, German Jewish philosopher. She fled Germany when the Nazis came into power, and she then, when in Israel, watched the proceedings of the Eichmann trials, the trials of Adolf Eichmann, who kind of orchestrated the, what's called in Germany, the Endlösung, the attempt to basically kill all Jewish people, and which led to the Holocaust. And she's basically shocked by how ordinary he talks about these things, by how much he kind of talks about basically, okay, this is all something that's a little bit more about finding bureaucratic solutions to a problems rather than a kind of like a human who's thinking about other humans and killing them in systematic ways. So there's this idea out there that basically in an agentic state, I kind of remove the bureaucrat from the responsibility, and now they're blindly following orders, and whatever you give them, they will follow. And this is kind of like this message that infiltrated the interpretation of Milgram, and this is what's often called the agentic state agentic state explanation. You can find that in textbook, you can find it in students, you can find it probably when you had your A-levels, somebody would tell you something like that. But I think there are many problems with that. Some of are already outlined, right? That doesn't really fit with this kind of blindly following orders or human following orders, right? We also, I think like certain variations here don't really fit that well, okay? If there's no prompts, okay, there are no orders, people don't. But if there are some people who disobey, suddenly people don't follow orders. So it doesn't seem to be just about blindly following orders. You can also see that if the experimenter is removed and just calls in, right? That is like here now only 20 people out of 100 obey to the orders. So that's kind of how it's like an administrative apparatus works, right? Somebody calls you, somebody sends you an email and says you should do this or that. But if that only reaches 20 people out of 100, then doesn't really matter. For an agentic state, then it doesn't really work, right? For the agentic state hypothesis, this variation should not matter. It should also not matter whom we follow, right? So basically, if we kind of switch from science to ordinary, if we switch from science to more business, then suddenly obedience drops dramatically, okay? So if you and I were just prone to blindly follow orders, then these variations shouldn't really matter to us. It shouldn't matter whom we follow, it's just there's an authority figure, okay, they invited me to this experiment, now I will blindly follow that. So there are several critical points about this, and I think I'll allude to them. So Milgram often said, yes, his studies are about studying obedience, but also about disobedience. And some teach us more about disobedience than actually obedience, because in some of his variations, so few people actually followed the orders of the leaders. So it doesn't even, his body of work doesn't really say like, oh, people blindly follow. It is in a certain condition, a certain setup that people do. In many, many others, people don't. One interesting observation that was kind of coming up when the replication of the research was done is that it seems like that basically that people followed these three orders. But the moment in the replication, this is confirmed, the moment the experimenter had to say, you have no other choice, you must go on. This is when participants stopped. It seems like that these three basically represent one state of mind where they follow, but once they hear this, they're in a different state of mind. And now nobody who hears that follows in the replication that results. So Milgram even says like, okay, in one of his studies is a response, he reports about that people are not very good at responding to this prompt, right? He says that it's like, okay, he can't really, if this were Russia maybe, but not in America. It seems almost like there's a shift of allegiance, right? It's like, okay, this kicked it, that really changed it, and become, instead of becoming obedient, I become reactant. I will not follow your rules anymore. But for an autocratic kind of agentic state hypothesis, for a blindly following orders, this shouldn't matter. There shouldn't be something like that. And more stronger orders should not basically make people change their mind. So this kind of contradicts this as well. The other one is like people struggle. I think the idea here of the Eichmann trials and Hannah Arendt's banality of evil approach to trying to understand it is that people don't struggle. That you get your orders, you do it. Eichmann in his trial in Israel was never really troubled. He felt like, yes, but there's no problem. Of course course we killed them all. They were Jewish. That was the idea, right? He told it as if he was talking about his shopping list for the day. And that was the shocking thing. But in this experiment, you can see that people really, really struggle. They agonize it. They go shift unfortunately. So if you listen to the recordings, it's really uncomfortable listening. It's not somebody who's kind of like, okay, good, thank you. So that doesn't really fit as well. There's a reinterpretation that we come back to when we talk about in-group and out-groups, when we talk about our effects of groups on our behavior. And this reinterpretation is more about social identity. So here the idea is that I am a participant in a study where norms are uncertain, where it's basically in the beginning I'm told I'm doing an important experiment because we know so little about how punishment impacts learning, because all of these studies are done on animals. This is one of the few studies that is done with humans. So there's kind of like an importance to our endeavor. And the idea of this kind of social identity approach to understanding this behavior is we're saying like, okay, what participants do is basically they identify with the experimenter. We are on one team, okay? So there's a strong identification in this kind of ambiguous, uncertain situation to identify with the scientific community and then accept basically in this situation the scientist as the leader who kind of guides me through this complicated situation, okay? And anything that kind of shifts my identification with the scientific community to something higher, to my human bond with the participant, and kind of going into the community of the learners or the participants in experiments, any kind of variation of that undermines this identification with the kind of scientific group and shifts it to the identification with the participant group. So you can see that if you reinterpret these results, then it's more about that participants go into a situation trying to figure out, okay, what should I do here? And they look to a group and they look to a leader to be kind of led to what to do. And everything that undermines the leadership of that person or the identification with the scientific community leads to a dramatic drop in obedience. So it's not so much blindly following, but more about which group you choose to follow or which group you choose to identify with in uncertain situations.